So you will again, during Unit 3, contextualize and formulate a good question for your peer. While a lot of what I go over in this video will be the same as what you learned about just in writing during Unit 2 for Task 4, I am going to add a new requirement. It will not be written anywhere in the handout on contextualizing and formulating a good question. Rather, you're going to get the new requirement only verbally by listening to this video. So let's go over the objective. Remember that when you're contextualizing and formulating a good question, that you're constructing a paragraph that contextualizes and explains the significance of a question you generate for your peer to think through. That is with respect to their argument. Now here, this is the document from Unit 2, Task 4, and during Unit 2, we were focused on arguments where peers were talking about proving any claims about mask wearing are true. So what's different in this version of this kind of assignment is that we're not going to focus on that item 1 argument about the possibility of proving any claims about mask wearing are true. Rather, we're going to focus on the item 2 paragraphs where if you executed the instructions correctly during task 3 of Unit 1, you should have a paragraph that is actually also an argument about whether or not you would have been or conceive yourself to have been wearing a mask freely in a cited grocery store during the summer of 2020. Yes. Okay. So that is different, and you'll see that in the threads in the link to the dialectic board that goes with that. But otherwise, the assignment is generally the same. I'll add the new requirement in a bit. So let's go over the intellectual expectations again. So notice that I say the question, right? It says question you generate. This says formulate a question, the question you come up with. Now, you might be saying, why are you emphasizing and iterating this? Because I did get some responses, or I did see students respond to peers, and I didn't see a single question mark. Okay, so then it wasn't clear whether or not in those submissions a peer was just making a claim and they didn't set it up properly, or if they were asking a question but they forgot to put their question mark there. So if I'm telling you that you have to ask your peer a question, obviously I need to see a question mark. But also, despite the fact that this document is constantly talking about generating a question, I actually had submissions, not that many, but a few submissions where students didn't ask any kind of question, and instead they treated this kind of a task like a generic discussion board where maybe you just say what you like or don't like about somebody's response, or agree or don't agree, or just raise an objection, but there was not a single question asked of their peer, giving them food for thought for them to answer. So that's why I'm stressing that. So now let's talk about this part. So this is the same, but I do want to make some iterations, again, with respect to submissions that were lacking in some way. So step 1, of course, you read about and follow with strict adherence the mandatory paragraph template below. So this is what I'm talking about right here. This is the mandatory paragraph template, and I saw varying degrees of attention to all what is entailed in following this template when I was grading some submissions from a previous unit. Then it says step 2, select a peer to whom you would respond via the Task 4C dialectic link. And then it says, of course, make sure your selection shows attention to what I say about whom you can choose. Said information is presented online. So I have to actually add this to the Unit 3 folder and the Unit 4 folder, but I will present this information. I give you very specific instructions on how to select a peer, and the point is, by following my instructions, we end up with the case, or we end up with things such that no one student has 2 responses. So make sure you follow those instructions that I'll be sure to add or have added to Task 4 for this unit by the time you get to this video or need to submit. Okay, so then some submissions I saw were lacking with respect to steps 2A through 2C. So this says click on your selected peer's thread. And of course, you have to select a peer who has not already been claimed or for whom there is not a response yet. Step 2B, copy your peer's argument. Now, some of your peers, if they didn't follow the instructions carefully or didn't master the concept of an argument from a Task 3 lesson, they might not have an argument, but they will have a paragraph. But for the most case, if a student didn't have an argument, what I did was I copied and pasted an argument from some other student a previous semester and decided that for that peer, we would just use somebody else's argument. So if your peer didn't construct an argument for item 2, they didn't get credit for somebody else's argument. I just used it so that everyone could complete this task, because you're supposed to focus on an argument. All right, so for some of you, very few of you, but still some of you did not do this step at all. So you're supposed to copy your peer's argument paragraph and then click on reply to your peer's thread. And then step 2D says, I should see 2 paragraphs, your selected peer's argument and then your response to it below it. This means you should have to copy and paste the original argument when replying to said argument, placing your paragraph long response below his or her argument. So here are some good examples where peers did just that. So here's a score of 100. So this person in one of my classes, they copied and pasted the response of the peer to whom they were replying. They clicked on reply, they copied and pasted, and then they put their contextualizing and question generation paragraph. There's another example of that done correctly with varying degrees of quality. So down here, we're to the grade of 88. Here's an example of somebody who didn't do that. This person got a 61 for various reasons. They actually got a 71 just for the paragraph for contextualizing and generating question, but they lost 10 points. Why? Because they didn't follow the instructions that I just went over in steps 2A through 2D, which is to copy and paste the argument to which you are responding when replying to a peer. This forces me to have to open up another window, click on more things, have 2 windows open, and then look at 2 different screens to evaluate. This time I only took off 10 points for not presenting the argument above the contextualizing generating paragraph. But next time, students who don't do that part will lose half the credit. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's continue to go over the instructions. And again, this is going to be for, this document here is giving you examples or actual student submissions from Unit 2. But I'm not going to get into this document right now. Then read about the mandatory paragraph template. Okay, so by the time I get to the end of this part, and I'm not going to go over all this in detail at all. I'll just iterate, hey, generally this kind of information's on this page or whatnot. But I do want to get into detail about this part. And like I said, it's in this part of the video that I'll add the missing requirement. So it says, start your paragraph by quoting a claim that you have decided to focus on from your peer's response. So some people, very few, but some people did not start with that. This has to be your very first sentence. And it says quoting. Some people paraphrased, or some people didn't tell me what premise they were focusing on at all. Notice that it says use an introductory clause. Some people just plopped down the quote, but had no introductory clause. You can't just put a quote down as your first sentence. You have to have some kind of introduction to the quoted material. So make sure you keep that in mind. And remember, you cannot choose the conclusion. So next, in the same paragraph, present a well-formulated, well-written question for your peer to address. Again, some people, either it was hard to tell if they were asking a question because there was no question mark, so it seemed like maybe they were just making a claim. If that was the case, they were just making a claim, then they didn't follow the instructions of asking a question. But it was pretty clear in a few examples that some people didn't bother to ask a question at all. So what is the point of this? This is what some people seem to miss by not asking a question, right? That is, the question you come up with should not be one that can be answered with a simple yes or no. Rather, the question you come up with should stimulate your peer to think further or more deeply about their own thought. So I think that what some people did, again, it's a very few, but what some people did is they decided that they would just make some comments, make some claims about their peer's argument as food for thought. But that's not what this assignment is about. It's about composing a meaningful question for the peer to answer, to deepen or extend her thought. So that was a very important thing. Okay, so lastly, in the same paragraph, so some of you either didn't do this one at all, this part of the paragraph, or you didn't do it correctly, or you didn't show explicit attention to it, or you didn't do it accurately or effectively. Maybe you thought you were doing this part, but you didn't actually do this part. And this is the part to which I am going to add a new requirement. But let's see what is the same. So lastly, in the same paragraph, explain to your peer why you think it's important for him or her to address the question you formulate. Here is something really important. Do not answer the question. Just explain why it's important to answer the question. So I did see some submissions where students might ask a question, but then they spend either too much time, just like as if they're continuing to converse in real time on the topic with a peer, or they're starting to give their own answer to the question, or they are just giving their opinions about the topic. And that's not what this part is about. So you really need to study the actual examples that I give you for how you execute this part of the paragraph. You find the actual content examples. So I give you questioning strategy examples that reflect the template on pages 2 and 3, but I give you actual content examples only on page 3. And so the example starts right here. Give me just a second. I'm going to expand the window so I can scroll up. Right here. So see, it says 3 examples showing attention. Study again these examples that are here in this section because they do a really good job showing you that the template is being adhered to 100%. And look at element 3. Element 3, or that component, that third component, not necessarily the third sentence. It depends on how many sentences you need to contextualize and generate your question. But the idea is that element 3 of this paragraph has to explain why it's important for your peer to answer to the question. How do you do that explicitly? You say, it's important for you to answer this question, or the significance of my question is, but really you should just say, it's important for you to answer this question because that's the most direct and explicit way to show me that you're dealing with this part. And notice how in these examples, the peer is not like just carrying on the conversation, answering the question, or starting to give his or her own opinion. They're explaining the significance relative to the question asked, given the evidence or the claim quoted from the peer argument. So that is my advice as your coach, is that when you're ready to get to this last part of the paragraph, start it off by saying it's important for you to answer this question because. Just say it like that. If you want, I give you permission. It will not count as plagiarism. All right, so now, notice here I said optional approved sources in explaining the significance of your question. You might find it helpful to cite something relevant from Chapter 2 of the Smart Book Reading on Epistemology, since the argument topic is of interest to epistemologists. You cannot use any other sources. Okay, so for this version of this assignment, I do want you at the end of the paragraph to explain why your question is significant in virtue of our focus for this unit. Our focus for this unit has been metaphysics. Remember, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. And when it comes to metaphysics, we focused not on the mind-body problem that you read about in the Smart Book, but we focused on the problem of free will. We focused on the challenges of metaphysical determinism and whether it's true. Is everything the result necessarily of prior causes? Does every thought, feeling, and emotion have a cause? Every desire and wish? If so, can we still have free will? If so, what are the conditions for saying we have free will, even if everything is caused? If not, then how does one try to reject that everything's caused? What are the implications for that? So I'm just kind of reminding you of the big ideas, the big questions that you came across in the lesson for Unit 3 and the Smart Book focus. I might have said Chapter 3, but I meant to say Chapter 2. So Unit 3, Chapter 2. So when you're doing this assignment, what I want you to keep in mind actually overall is what the focus was for Unit 3. So I would actually encourage you to reread the introductory section to Chapter 2. I'm sorry if I keep saying Chapter 3. Chapter 2. Reread the introductory section. And actually, I would skip because I've told students to do that and then they focus too much on stuff that's not directly relevant to the paragraph. Focus instead, I believe it's 2.6. Go to the section where Lawhead first starts to introduce you to the problem of free will and determinism. I'm pretty sure that is section 2.6, and I'm pretty sure the title of that is the Freedom and Determinism. reread that. That is where he introduces you to the concept of circumstantial freedom, metaphysical freedom. It's where he introduces you to the three statements he uses to organize his presentation of three metaphysical theories about free will, and where he initially introduces you to three theories about metaphysical determinism and free will and moral responsibility. Then, what I recommend is then you need to read your peer responses and select one. If after doing this you had selected somebody, you want to unclaim them and claim somebody else, you can do that. Just put, I no longer claim this peer, and then claim a new peer. But it's really important for you to keep the intellectual, philosophical, metaphysical context in mind when responding to a peer argument this time. So then when you formulate the question that you come up with, you do need to show attention to, you do need to quote from something a peer says, but you want to have in mind what you learned about how a metaphysician or a philosopher might look at an argument. What might somebody who has studied free will, thought about metaphysical determinism, thought about, moral responsibility and free will and causality, what might they point out about your peer's argument? What question might a philosopher or a metaphysician of free will have? So you still follow all of the steps, but now I want you to try to have the point of view of a metaphysician who is interested in the problem of free will. Then, when you're explaining the significance at the end, so lastly, right, at the end of your paragraph, I want the way that you explain the significance of your question to draw from and show that you were really paying attention to and trying to think through what you learned, at least from the introductory section. And it might help you to review the theories. You can even explain the significance from the point of view of a theorist. You might need more than one sentence to do this version of the assignment when you get to this last part, so you could have 2 or 3 sentences. Just remember, do not answer the question for your peer. You're only explaining why is it significant. Why is answering the question of metaphysical significance? Why is it important given what you learned about freedom and determinism, some of the issues and questions that came up? So this is going to be a new thing. So with that said, when you're borrowing from and referencing and studying that material, you do not want to plagiarize. So even if you just paraphrase, even if you just kind of scan or look at, and definitely if you quote or paraphrase, make sure that in that paragraph, in this part, you put the page number that you're using to inform how you're explaining the metaphysical significance of your question about their argument. Because the argument that you are working with in the dialectic board for this unit, it's a metaphysical argument, or it's supposed to be a metaphysical argument about free will, right? So you can see how it's all coming together now, the curriculum. Okay, so keep this in mind as well. All right, so just remember that this is the mandatory template that you have to use. These are examples of the kinds of questions you can contextualize and formulate in a paragraph-long response. If you use one of these as your template, then you are meeting all the requirements here. But it always, even if you decide to use one of these as your template, make sure you double check that you really have followed through with all of this. I'm wondering if some people used a template from page 2 or 3, but didn't quite understand what was going on in the last sentence of one of these templates because they didn't double check what was going on in the last sentence with the mandatory main template. And then again, make sure you study these things. So I gave you the new requirement just about a minute ago. These are examples of actual student submissions from Unit 2. As you can see, the document tells you to compare the quality of student submissions with the mandatory template, with the actual examples of using said templates. Look at the examples that have 100. This student actually forgot to give them extra credit because I did say in that document that I was reviewing that you can get extra credit for numbering the different parts of the template. So here they're saying, here's element 1 of the mandatory template on page 1, here's element 2 of the mandatory template, and here's element 3. So I need to go back and give the student an extra 5 points. Here's another example of 100. Again, you can see they copied and pasted the peer argument, and then they have their paragraph where they contextualize, they have their quote, they have their question, then they explain the significance. So they have the question, but it's contextualized. Another 100 here. So you can make 100. In your class, It could be that this is from your class. In fact, this is from one of my fall classes, and 3 people made 100 on it. This is a small section. Here's a B. What's lacking in this B response? Study it. And you can even study examples that got a 25. So in this one got a 25 because they didn't even ask a question and they didn't show direct attention to saying, hey, this is important because, and instead they're just giving their own opinions. In this one, they don't show attention to all aspects of the mandatory template, and they don't even seem to really ask a question. I'm not sure. Another problem is that what they do have to say it's not a compelling thing to bring up in light of the argument and what it was supposed to be proving. This really isn't good, relevant, meaningful things to bring up, even if it was a question. So, your questions need to really show a serious attempt to get your student to really think more about their metaphysics, their metaphysical presuppositions, assumptions, how they defined free will, something in that era, or it could be their assumptions about everything being caused or not being caused, or just, it could be relevance. I'm being careful with talking about, get them to think about their concept or their assumptions. Your question could get them to do that, to think about their concepts that they use, to think about the relevance of something they said. But of course, you could also use any of the questioning strategies and call their attention to anything that I give you here as examples of, strategies you might use for your questioning. Okay, well, that's all I have. If you did not save a copy of the download from Unit 2, Task 4, you might want to go back through this video and take pictures with your phone, or just work through your response through this video. So you could just reread this and then pause the video when you get to right here, do this part, then continue to watch the video, read through this. If you downloaded and saved this file, you have it. Just remember that the topic here for the objective here is different. You're not responding to an argument about the possibility of proving claims about masquerading are true. You're responding to a peer argument about whether or not they think that they were wearing a mask of their own free will in grocery stores in the summer of 2020. This was initially presented for Task 4 of Unit 2, but 99.99% of it is the same for Unit 3, so I didn't redo the document. And of course, you now know that I am looking for something in addition to what was expected during Unit 2. I'm done, Amor.